My name is Maaza Mengiste. I am a novelist, and I have just released a new book called The Shadow King, and that was 10 years after my first book, which is called Beneath the Lion's Gaze. I'm here in London on a visit and doing some book talks, and it's been wonderful to be here.
Okay, that's amazing. 10 years. So has this book been in the making for 10 years, or has it just been a gap in between?
It has been in the making for 10 years, almost 10 years. A lot of writing, a lot of research, but mainly revising and rewriting. Yeah, it's been a long process, but it's been good. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Having read it, I think the 10 years were worth it. It's great. So
Thank you. That's the best thing anyone can say.
It was definitely worth it. I wanted to know where the idea for the story and the background and just the general idea for the book came from.
When I was first starting the book, I had no real idea about women in war, and women particularly in this war. I was going to write the story that I had heard growing up, which is of an army of men charging against Italians, and Mussolini's army was the most advanced in Europe at the time, and Ethiopians somehow won. They shouldn't have won. It was a completely illogical win, but they won. And for a little kid, that story is epic. It's a myth, it's legend. And I grew up thinking, this is amazing. And when I started writing, I thought, this is a story I would really like to do. I think it would be inspiring. Once I got into the research, though, I started realizing how much I did not know about this war. I had never imagined the realities of what war is like. I was thinking of just moments of bravery all the time. But you can't do that. That's not really war. That's not war on a daily basis. So I realized there was more I needed to know. And then as I started finding out that women were following behind the men, carrying the food, carrying the water, taking care of the wounded, burying the dead, I started thinking, oh, they were more involved than I thought. But then in my research, I started finding out that women were actually also in the front lines. That completely changed the book for me. And that's where The Shadow King really came alive.
I think it's interesting that the title is The Shadow King, and not The Shadow Queen, for example, but the book is mostly about female characters, right? There are male characters in it, and they are interesting and complex in their own rights. But to me, at least, the female characters are the protagonists.
Absolutely.
Was that intentional?
Yeah, because if you think about it, I could not replace my own thinking with their thinking. For example, the women that rose up were not replacing a queen. They were replacing the king who left. They were the Shadow Kings. There was no queen in this story. There is an empress, but she was not necessarily active. So the title was very deliberate. They took the place of the leader. They were not just a queen next to the king. So I wanted it to reflect that reality. So I knew it would be tricky, but that was what they were actually doing. And they say, in fact, at the end, we were the Shadow Kings. But there's also another thing behind that is we have the body double, who is the shadow of the real king. I don't want to say too much about that.
I don't think it's giving too much away. So it's all right. Yes.
And then you have Ettore, also the photographer who works with shadow and light, and he is, in a sense, a very powerful person within the shadows of the dark side of this war, and I wanted to reflect that as well.
And as the photographer, he is in the shadows, taking pictures.
Yes.
From behind.
Absolutely.
From behind the lens in this case. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I also wanted to know how much of the characters' stories are based on real people that you encountered both in your research, while you were doing the research, and maybe even in your personal life.
Well, the only person who is an actual figure in here would be Haile Selassie.
Right.
He's just a figment of my imagination, but he just happens to be a historical character. the other characters like Hirut, Aster, Kidana, Ettore, I'm sure they existed. People like that existed, but I didn't know them personally. But when I was writing this book, or really after I had written this book, and I was in the process of doing last-minute edits for it, I was in Ethiopia, and I went there for some last research. Talking to my mother, I discovered that my great-grandmother had been involved in the war, and in fact, very much like Hirut, had fought for her father's gun. I had no idea about this when I was writing Hirut's story. It was just this uncanny coincidence, and I was completely overwhelmed. I had been writing about these women, and yet there was one also in my own family.
That must have been such an unforgettable moment,
it really
right?
was. I
Especially,
will never forget.
right? Especially considering that you found out at the end of the research process and the editing of your book, it was all but ready, right? It was not at the beginning.
Yeah.
And you have mentioned this to me and to us before, so I wanted you to obviously mention it again, because it's something I've been thinking about, like how crazy in the realist sense of the word is this. But it also made me think about the kind of transmission of history between people, especially in Africa, and even within families, because this is something that you didn't know, and it was almost a coincidence that you found out. And it made me think, would that have been the case, for example, in my family, in a European family? Because every little thing we have to transmit that to the people after us. And what do you think that says about the way in which African families or people in general transmit history and the kind of value they put maybe even on their own history?
Yeah, I think when we talk about war, when we talk about bravery in conflict, we automatically look towards stories about men, about boys. We think that aggression is the territory of men and it's masculine. And I try to imagine what my mother and her sisters might have thought when they were talking about my great-grandmother, but never moving that story to me or to my brother or anyone else in our family, as far as I know. I think what happens is the story of women is kept within the world of women. And no one thinks that what's spoken in the kitchen is as important as what's spoken in a boardroom or in the university. But women are the carriers of history as much as anything, but because those stories happen within their spaces, no one thinks that that's important, including the women themselves.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I'm challenging everyone, people who have read this book, I am asking them to go back to their families, ask about the stories that they may not have heard. And I've since gotten emails, and I just posted something a few days ago on Instagram and on Twitter. Someone asked a family member about the war. They were talking about my book, and the person just mentioned that her grandmother fought in the war. We had no idea. I have known this woman since I was a baby. Never heard this story. So that's only one, and I've been receiving others. So I'm telling everyone, just ask your family. See what comes up, because I think the stories are there.
Right. While you were researching it for a very long time, what kind of difficulties, if any, did you encounter, especially considering that you talk and write about a part in history that is kind of absent from the mainstream discourse? People don't really talk about it that much, especially in the Ethiopian context. You know, Mussolini, everybody kind of knows about him, but what happened in Ethiopia is much less often talked about. So were there any specific difficulties or any hurdles you had to overcome to get to the research?
Yeah, I lived in Rome for a while, and I was doing research there. So I had a group of scholars, academics, writers who were really supportive of me, who were able to pass me documentation, things that they had written about this moment in Italian and Ethiopian history. But I still needed to go into the archives and look at things. And one day I was in Rome I was in the Discoteca di Stato. So I was there to look at archives of speeches and anything that had been recorded, radio, anything like that, film. And it was my first day there. So I went in and they asked me to fill out a form, with your name and what you need. So I filled my name and I said, I'm looking for recordings of, the fascist period, the colonial era, Ethiopia, anything, 1935 to 1941. So, and then I gave it to this woman, the librarian, and she took it and she looked at it. And then she looked at me, and then she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, un attimo, hold on. And she ran to the office. And then I was just waiting there for a while. I see 3 heads pop up outside of the office, and they look at me, and they go back in the office. So I just wait, and a gentleman comes out, and he said, okay, we will have the things for you. Please just go into this room here. You can put on the headphones and we'll be there in one moment. I said, okay. So I went and I just was sitting there for a long time, waiting. Oh, and then I see something out of the corner of my eye and I look, and there's a man carrying a stack of records, recordings, everything. And he walks by and he looks at me and I look at him and he just walks by. There's no one else there. I know it's mine.
Yeah.
So I wait and I said, okay. And then he walks back and he walks in and finally he just comes into the room. There's a chair next to me. Mm-hmm. He pulls up the chair. He sets the things down. He pulls up the chair, sits down. And he keeps saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about what we did to your people. I'm so sorry. Oh my God. He said, there are 3 things Italians are ashamed of: Mussolini, mafia, and Berlusconi. He said, I'm so sorry.
What?
Yeah. And then he sat with me and I watched these things. And the whole time he's like, wait, and then he left and let me alone to work.
Wow. Okay.
But I realized in that moment, that whole series of interactions with everyone along the way, this is a really difficult history. Mm-hmm. Italians haven't addressed it completely yet. This was one of the more positive experiences, that people were not rude to me. I've had people, both in the archives, in libraries, and other places, become very agitated, and they just want me gone. But then I have these experiences which are, they don't know what to do, but they want to help. I think that this history is something that we still have to talk about. Mm-hmm. But I think it is starting, the conversations are starting, and it has been going on with people in Italy, Italians who are invested in making this history more known. And they have been generous to me in my research. Yeah.
That's really fascinating, the difference in responses.
Yeah.
And I expected kind of both of them, the one side and the other side. Yeah. So in terms of archival material that you looked at, and in terms of amounts or like number of files, or just in general the amount of material that you have looked at during your research, did you find more in Italian archives or in Ethiopian archives or institutions?
In Ethiopia, mm-hmm. I found personal stories. I found stories that were relayed to me by people who were the relatives of those who had actually fought. I could look at swords and spears and old guns and that kind of information. I could go to the sites where there were battles, and that's a lot of the research. Mm-hmm. Oral storytelling as well as actual artifacts. Mm-hmm. In Italy were the documents that the Italians kept from their side of the war. Mm-hmm. But what I was trying to find is in between those, how could I make a story? How could I look at what the Ethiopians are saying and what the Italians are saying, both of which would have their own kinds of propaganda, and try to find a more accurate vision of the war from looking at both of those things. So I was often looking at one, but knowing that's not the full story, listening to something else and saying, but there's more here, and then working to combine both of them.
Right. So in terms of the kinds of materials, it differs between Italy and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But in terms of number, that it's even-ish, or is there like a striking imbalance, or?
Well, Italians kept a lot more documents. Ethiopians were in the mountains fighting. You know, the Italians had brought their journalists over. They were they wanted to document their victories, and when they were losing, they would still change the results. So I was finding a lot more documents on the Italian side, but a lot more maybe details of what was being done during the battles from the Ethiopian side, from a personal level.
Right. I find it really interesting because Ethiopia was never formally colonized by Italy, yet they still have so much of Ethiopia's history and of their collective history. It's a collective history in a way, right?
Yeah.
That's why I asked the question, because as a researcher myself, I'm always interested. The amount of documents you have often tell the story already, or at least part of it.
Yes. I mean, Italy was there almost 40 years before trying to colonize. And when that didn't work, I think there was still a relationship that developed between the two countries. Italy was also in Eritrea and in Somalia. So there was a constant communication between the countries. And then the war came, and it was already a developed relationship. It was not brand new. But now it was, Italians were trying to change that relationship.